Good evening, everybody. This is once again the world where we live and in unfamiliar surroundings. See a lot of flowers on the back walls, but I'm not intimidating. Tonight we're going to discuss a very controversial topic, the legalization of marijuana referendum. This is my friend Alex Robinson. He is a paramedic, he's with the medical profession, and will be voting yes on the referendum if he hasn't already.
I certainly have.
I, on the other hand, have certainly voted no. And tonight we are going to discuss this topic. Alex, would you like to, with an opening statement, explain why you'll be voting yes?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Jared. My first argument for the legalization of cannabis for its recreational purpose, or as it's worded, is re-looking at the legislation surrounding the criminalization of cannabis, is the medicinal implications of it in patients who need it. So at the moment, medicinal cannabis, as some may think, is legal within New Zealand. Yes, we have a couple of substances, a couple of products on the market which can be prescribed through your GP. Specifically, we're looking at something called cannabidiol, or more commonly known as CBD. So under the 2017 amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, they removed cannabidiol from it and added it into the Medicines Act 1981, through which it can now be prescribed. So CBD is a fantastic product in terms of its medical implementation. There are multiple medical journals supporting the use of it for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, treatment of anxiety, treatment of some painful conditions, and inflammatory conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and fibromyalgia. However, whilst CBD is a fantastic product and it has its place within the medical industry, currently it's not funded by Pharmac. We import a product known as, there are a couple on the market at the moment, the most common being Tilray. Tilray is a product which is produced by a Canadian manufacturer. It comes into New Zealand. Because of our excellent and strict quality standards, it needs to pass minimum quality standards prior to it hitting the market, which it has. All this process, the importation, the taxation, and passing these standards costs. And before it hits the consumer, you're looking at a product which, in nowadays, several years after the implementation of this into the law, is still about $600 for roughly a month's supply. Now that is ridiculously unaffordable, as it's not funded by Pharmac. That, for the average consumer, is an unreachable product. A legal market, if we're just looking at CBD, would allow growers in New Zealand to put products forward for the market. If they pass minimum standards, they will reach the market. And this is something that could be purchased in a dispensary, which I'll get onto later. My main argument is I'm currently studying medicinal cannabis science at AUT. And something I've found is the products which are available are limited to CBD. So the cannabis plant itself has what we call cannabinoids, so the cannabis chemicals. There are 113 of which CBD is one. We've talked about that. THC, and that's the big controversial one. That is the one which causes the intoxicating effects, or getting you stoned, as they call it. So THC, very well known. That is an issue in the illicit market, which I'll touch on later. But THC and other cannabinoids are still restricted under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So there is emerging evidence out of the countries which have legalized recreational use and have had for many years an open medicinal cannabis market, which facilitates patients accessing broad spectrum products and accessing medicines with THC in it, including the raw cannabis plant itself. They have found in studies that broad spectrum products with other cannabinoids, which may or may not have THC in them, or a THC level which is intoxicating, they have been found effective or more effective in the treatment of other conditions such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, cancer in some patients in terms of managing pain, in terms of managing hyperemesis, or increased vomiting and nausea, increasing appetite. There are a number of implications which patients are unable to access in New Zealand under current laws. So that would be my opening point for this. A lot of people, which is unfortunate, have not yet read the legislation or read the information surrounding the legalisation of cannabis, which I feel is leading towards a big no vote for a lot of people.
And that's fair enough. And I think for right from the very start, there's been a lot of this very, and I hate to admit it, it's mainly coming from my side of the fence, from the no voters.
The nopers, as we
They're
call
not
them.
the nopers. Well, say no to dope. That's this sort of catch cry, isn't it? But there's a big difference between a naysayer, which is what I am, and a doomsdayer, who's prone to scaremongering and other things like that.
Absolutely.
One of these, the no lobbyists' points have been, oh, they want to make medicinal cannabis legal, however, it already is. Now, yes, it may already be legal on paper, but you're absolutely right. It costs too much. Doctors are reluctant to prescribe it. They don't really have a framework behind them, supporting them if they do. And of course, it takes, I think fundamentally, it takes a special kind of heartless individual to be against the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes, and especially when it comes to palliative care. I want to be very clear on that from the start. However, this referendum is about recreational purposes. If I was going to propose an alternative, I would say to open up the market and to get medicinal cannabis more readily available. I would look at it from that sort of perspective. This legislation goes a lot further, and I think what's gotten a lot of people apprehensive is because it goes well beyond that. And basically what they see as it amounting to be putting into place is the opening up of the access to what is, at the end of the day, a harmful substance, no matter what anybody says. And the fear is that it will lead to increased use among the people who are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And if I may touch on that topic of the most vulnerable, when people talk about cannabis, you're absolutely right. This referendum is about the recreational use of cannabis, the decriminalisation and recreational legalisation. So a few of the points within the proposed cannabis legalisation and control bill are that there is going to be an age limit on it. So any piece of research you read will suggest, I mean, every substance is harmful to you. Alcohol, we know the effects of that.
We certainly do.
You eat too many bananas, you become hyperkalemic. That's not good for you. You take too many prescription medicines. That's not too good for you.
The Americans are finding that out now.
They sure are with their epidemics over there, unfortunately.
Pharmaceutical drugs, yeah, nasty stuff.
However, cannabis, whilst it is harmful in the long-term user, in order to cause any acute harm to oneself, do you know how much cannabis you need to consume in order to end your life?
More than is practical to consume.
You're looking at about 68 kilos. So for those of you who may or may not have used cannabis, so an interesting fact for the viewer, within New Zealand, we have a population of about 5-6 million. I'm not sure what the
just over 5, I think.
Yeah.
For now.
So studies have shown that approximately 80% of people have used cannabis at least once in their life or use it regularly. So 80% of our New Zealanders are using it. Of those, a lot of them are adolescents, teenagers, and any piece of evidence surrounding, the neurological state of the people of that age, they're unstable, they're growing, their brains are still in development. So putting cannabis on board there is not going to be good for their long-term development. And studies have shown that they do come forward, or they can unmask mental health disorders like schizophrenia. They can have acute episodes of psychosis secondary to cannabis exposure. So what the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill is suggesting is that a 20+ age limit is implemented should it pass. So at the moment, if you had a brother, a sister, a family member, the age of 15, 16, doesn't matter, they can walk down to their local tinny house, they can go up, they can give them their money, and they will sell them the drug. And that drug they receive is not regulated, it's not controlled, no one knows what's inside it. They could have laced it with meth. We don't know what fertilizers it's used. It hasn't passed any quality standards. This is a raw product that's come from goodness knows what, of some guy who knows a chap who told him about him. Now that product, they can take it away and they can use it. And as studies have shown, 98% of people are absolutely fine. They use cannabis and they have no adverse effects. 2% have an adverse reaction. So of those 2%, the adverse reaction, the most common things we see is paranoia, anxiety. In the severe cases, palpitations, tachyarrhythmias, which self-revert after the drug has worked through these systems. And the biggest, most severe is an episode of psychosis, which is an extremely rare state. And if, as some doctors have suggested, those people who have those episodes have underlying mental health conditions which may have been exposed by the exposure to cannabis. So with a controlled substance, one of the biggest things for me is that 20+ age limit. So you were a teenager, as was I. We know they can be cunning. So there's nothing to say that they're not going to get their friends to go down the road and buy it for them, or they're going to get their mum or their brother or whoever it may be to go down to the dispensary and purchase the cannabis product for them. However, you have to ask yourself, if they're going to consume it anyway, just like as a 17, 16-year-old chap, you might have stolen a beer from your dad's fridge or something like that. It's isn't it better that they get something that's controlled and past a minimum standard that we know is safe, compared to, if you look at the days of prohibition, you think about the speakeasies overseas, the moonshiners. People were making alcohol out of goodness knows what, and people were dying left, right, and centre. It was an unregulated and uncontrolled market. So, in my view, if there is legalisation and an age limit, it will be safer for the younger generation, and should they access it, it will be a safe product.
It's being sold as a silver bullet, as it were, to take out the black markets, to take the supply of cannabis from an unregulated product to a regulated one. Mm. However, and there will be a lot of statistics coming out tonight in this discussion, and there are limitations to the data. We simply don't have enough of a time frame to come to meaningful conclusions in a lot of cases. Some Canadian studies have pointed to, like you say, you put the age limit on, you get teenagers smoking less pot. Fair enough. If that's working well, so be it. However, they've also uncovered other, 3-4 years later, they've also uncovered other effects, and a notable one, which has been it's been bandied about by the say nope to dope crowd, but whereby only 29% of the pot smokers in Canada were getting their weed through legal means, and that was a very they always take the lowest possible results for these sorts of studies. But even in the best case scenario, from the surveys, they were finding that, so that's the 29% who don't get any pot from, who get all their pot from through the legal channels. Yeah. Also, they had 42% would get their day's quota of pot through the legal channels and just use the black market to top it up. The black market has not been killed. There is plenty of unregulated cannabis still going around. And I think this comes down more to immense difficulties involved. Perhaps it's even impossible to regulate something like this, because you say it yourself, reducing the THC goes back to the pharmacological properties of the drug itself. The active ingredient is also the harmful ingredient. You reduce the THC, it's not as effective, it's not as alluring, and people just aren't going to go for this government mandated product that you pay tax on, even if it's more widely available. And in terms of lacing the cannabis with other things, boosting the THC, with putting other drugs in it, they do that because people want it. They want higher potency. They want more effects. And unfortunately, that's the be all and end all. I think that it's being sold as something that's going to rid the world of the unregulated market, but that is a wildly inaccurate assessment. It's not the problem with the legislation itself, it's a problem with the difficulties or even the impossibility of regulating a market such as this.
Absolutely, it is a very big claim, and I don't believe that this is coming from someone who's in support of the Legalisation and Control Act. I don't believe that it will knock out the black market entirely. However, like anything, we need to start from somewhere. Like every act and legislation that's implemented, there's always going to be teething problems. And I believe that if we are going to do this, we need to do it right. We need to stomp it on the head, like our Prime Minister Jacinda has said. Putting someone in jail for smoking a plant is pointless. And the biggest, another point I'd like to touch on is the criminal aspect. So the implementations for people who do choose to use cannabis as consenting adults, the implications of that decision they make down the track, should they get caught. Police have been given discretion. They are encouraged to use it and to not penalise people in the possession of cannabis, unless, of course, it's with the intention of distribution. However, that doesn't veer from the point that we are still seeing people with cannabis convictions for smoking a plant, which is, for the lack of better terms, although it has its issues, safe. From a medical perspective, I have been working in the medical industry for about 11 years. I have never had to support a patient's airway because of cannabis. I have lost count of the amount of people I've had to do that for this year. In 11 years, I've been to 11 people as a result of cannabis, 3 of which have been admitted to hospital, none of which were in a serious condition. Of those 3 people, the substance worked through their system and they went home. The others I attended to needed, for a lack of better explanation, a blanket, a hot cocoa, a bag of Doritos, and some cartoons, as we associate with the thing itself.
They weren't in a bad way.
No, they needed a bit of reassurance, and they were absolutely fine. And that brings me back to the product itself. So as you spoke about, the high THC content isn't great, and people do want that high. So what the New Zealand government is proposing with the Legalisation and Control Bill is, of course, as we talk about it, legalisation, so decriminalising it, and control. Control is the big thing. So as I said before, they're not going to tackle the black market overnight. I have seen those studies you are talking about, and I have read a lot of the stuff from the Nope to Dope campaign. A lot of the information that they are putting forward is quite rudimentary, and some of which is outdated. So for anyone who's on the fence, I would suggest please do your own reading. However, I've got friends in Canada, and they've found that getting it through a legal source is not only safer and easier, but some of the products are just as good. In New Zealand, we will have a limit on the cannabis which can be purchased per day, and that limit is currently set at 14 grams, so approximately half an ounce of cannabis. For anyone who hasn't used cannabis in the past, half an ounce is, so we talk about, if we were to put it within a unit, 1 unit of cannabis, or for example, a joint, is approximately 0.25 grams. So
2 joints a day, basically.
Oh, 0. So we're looking at a lot of weed, for
It certainly
lack
is.
of a better word. So 14 grams is a lot of cannabis, and that is aimed at the market. If someone can afford half an ounce of cannabis a day, there needs to be some sort of intervention should they be doing this on a regular basis, and I'll come back to that later. But the idea of that is to entice people to go for the legal option. We're looking at putting a cap in our THC, which is associated with, in some of the studies I've read, is associated with less instances of side effects, such as both long-term and short-term. So a lower THC dosage and a controlled dosage, we're looking at, within New Zealand, at a controlled THC rate of about 10 to 15%, which is at the highest spectrum in comparison to other countries which have legalized it. However, this is aimed at tackling that market. And as I said before, this is a new act. And with that is teething problems. This isn't going to be a fix overnight should it become law. But like any act, you look at the Crimes Act 1961, how many amendments have there been as the time has changed over years? This would be a new thing, and we would be able to amend it should it pass to better suit our needs as time passes. So whilst the 10 to 15% THC is quite high, it is aimed at that market. So people will be more enticed. And in Canada, I have now seen recently that in the last 2 years, the legal sales has overtaken the illicit sales of cannabis. So whilst it won't be an overnight fix, I think it is a step in the right direction.
And that is true. A lot of the early lack of uptake of the legal marijuana in Canada was due to there simply not being enough facilities to provide it.
Mm.
That said, the black market still has several notable advantages. Buy it, it's tax-free.
Mm.
Unregulated means you can have all the THC you want. A lot of people like that. And I mean, you left me with quite a bit to unpack there. But there are plenty of studies from the American Lung Association that say that smoking or regular cannabis use is just as dangerous to the lungs as tobacco smoking.
I completely agree with you.
There was a very interesting reason why, and it sounds very rudimentary, of course, but simply when people smoke pot, they hold the smoke in their lungs for longer, therefore exposing the lungs to smoke, which, regardless of what's burning, smoke as the byproduct of any sort of combustion is carcinogenic.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have and this has been, of course, they like the quick ones. They like to make the memes out of it. But really, it does look awfully confusing when the government is talking about smoke-free New Zealand 2025 and potentially legalizing smoking marijuana. Yeah, it is a harmful substance in any dosage. And at the end of the day, there will be a price to pay for this.
Absolutely. In terms of the smoking, you're absolutely right. Any substance entering the lungs, so this is including in some early studies, even vaping has proven to have the same inflammatory response within the lungs as smoking, and cannabis is no different. If so, even more so, some cannabis users choose not to use filters on the cannabis they smoke. However, like you've seen growing up in this generation, smoking is something which is going out of fashion. You're seeing smoking less and less and less. And people may choose, with the products that are on the market, they may choose to ingest cannabis if they choose to do so through other methods. So currently on the market, there are cannabis teas, there are cannabis drinks, there are edibles such as cookies or brownies, as we talk about, or gummy bears. There are drops and pills, all different ways to ingest cannabinoids.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Do you think that, there's always the forbidden fruit and everything like this, especially with teenagers,
Absolutely.
They've all been teenagers. You tell them not to do something and they'll want to go ahead and do it. Do you think that eliminating the illegality of it is going to spur more people to want to take it up?
I believe people will try it. Like any new thing, people will want to jump in there and try it. However, I believe again, and I come back to this controlled market with a capped THC content, with a regulated market, that if they do choose to try it, it will be in a safe place. Under the Legalisation and Control Bill, it is illegal to consume cannabis in public. So it can only be consumed on a licensed premise or in someone's home, and it will be illegal to be intoxicated within public. So there are those constraints for those people who are concerned about stoners running around the streets everywhere.
Stoners don't really run around too much.
They are generally not, from what I've found. But
it's not an immediately harmful drug. The problems that it causes develop over time. Absolutely. You're not going to smoke a joint, like you've pointed out. You're not going to smoke a joint and kill somebody or anything like that.
I certainly hope not.
In fact, there was even an old propaganda film from the 1930s. It's now a cult classic. It's called Reefer Madness, and it was basically this propaganda film. The working title was "Tell Your Children," and it was all about, just completely respectable, law-abiding men smoke a joint and they start shooting each other and killing and everything like that. And it was massively criticized when it was released back in the 1930s for its inaccurate depiction of the side effects of smoking marijuana. So it's nothing new that, and if people are really thinking about that, that is little more than scaremongering that's based on very inaccurate information.
Absolutely. The way that cannabis is depicted has been quite botched over the years. However, with the likes of social media, it's becoming more apparent to those who choose to seek this information that it is not the harmful substance that it is made out to be, within moderation. Like anything, if you go out and have 10 shots of absinthe, most likely your night is going to not go particularly well.
Yeah.
Just like that with the use of cannabis, if you have too much, you're more likely to have adverse effects such as anxiety or paranoia. I believe that the main thing that will assist us, should the legislation pass, is the part of the legislation under control. One of the biggest things that Chloe from the Greens has been pushing is the educational side of things. So if we look at smoking, when I was growing up, it was common. You'd go to a restaurant or to a bar with, not myself, I was underage then, but you would go to a restaurant, and one of the first questions a waiter would ask you is smoking or non-smoking. There would be segregated places within a restaurant that people were allowed to smoke.
That's right.
As New Zealand decided to take control of smoking and control it for its for the better health of the population, they banned things like that. They banned smoking in public. They banned not in public. Sorry, we're still working on that one.
First, I believe in 1990, it was smoking in public places,
Absolutely.
in your restaurants and your bars.
So
then in 2005 or 4, it was no smoking in the workplace, and you couldn't even have designated smoking areas in restaurants. I believe that's the legislation you're referring to.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
So if you look at the control of tobacco over the years, in comparison, you look at the rapid implementation of the Psychoactive Substances Act 19, gosh, I'm a bit out of date, 2017. So it was implemented secondary to outcry about synthetic cannabinoids. If I can first go off by saying the comparison of synthetic cannabis to cannabis itself is absolutely outrageous. They are two completely different substances, and the fact that they're even put in the same category disappoints me.
It's because they look similar and they're consumed in a similar way, but
absolutely. But they were sold at every dairy, every alcohol store, every corner shop. You could purchase a synthetic cannabinoid, and as we spoke about with those products, when they were legal, we never saw a massive amount of people who had problems. You got the occasional person who had the same effects as you would with a high THC cannabis product. So we got the anxiety, the palpitations and stuff, but we never saw severe adverse reactions. And as soon as the implementation of the Psychoactive Substances Act came in, They were immediately removed from the market. You had people stockpiling, and you had people creating black market synthetic cannabinoids. As soon as they hit the street, it resulted in a massive endemic of people dying. I can remember responding to 5 to 10 incidents a day on Queen Street and around the central CBD in Auckland of people who have used these synthetic cannabinoids, which have been manufactured through the black market with uncontrolled and unregulated chemicals. And it was harmful to their health. There were people who were having seizures. There were people who had respiratory impairment. These are people who, unfortunately, some ended up dying as a result of taking these drugs.
That's right, it was in the news at the time.
And I see, the way I see it at the moment is we currently have an unregulated cannabis market. Whilst cannabis is in no way comparable to synthetic cannabis, it has similarity in the sense that currently we have an illegal market. If you look at the research, there are suggestions that a legal market with a capped THC content, and a study I read recently that came out of the United States suggests that having a minimum CBD or cannabidiol limit within a legal product, due to its neuroprotective effects, actually decreases the instances of mental health disorders further.
And that's fair enough. But in terms of the mental health disorders, there has been an abundance of research pointing toward the psychoactive effects. Most clearly schizophrenia. And whilst the demographic most at risk for that are teenagers and adolescents, it does not necessarily reduce as you get older. And that's been an obvious argument. I mean, you mentioned alcohol a few times. Yes, we have an enormous problems with alcohol in this country. Nobody is denying that. The fallacy of that is people trying to justify, because alcohol is legal, because we have an enormous number of problems with alcohol, we think it's fair to add an enormous number of problems with marijuana. And at the end of the day, it comes back to the fact that it is a harmful substance, and legalizing it, allowing people to grow it at home. They're going to regulate the amount of THC levels and what you grow at home. Not practically, I'm sure.
Unfortunately, that is one of the downfalls of the legalisation and control bill. But as I said, I come back to my statements about the criminalisation, that side of it.
All right.
The smoking aspect, absolutely, that's not particularly great for your health. That's going out of fashion, as we spoke about. But the mental health is the biggest issue, I find. I think that people are going to smoke it. As we said, it's 80% of the population have tried it at least once. I'm relying on responsible Kiwis, and I'm trusting with a yes vote that Kiwis will be responsible. If you look at the education campaigns that you have in school, we're seeing this next generation drinking less. We're not seeing the same binge drinking culture. Smoking is controlled through the education campaigns, the increase in taxes, controlling where it can be consumed. So I feel that legalisation will take control of this market, and through a combination of education, taxation, and control, with the added addition of mental health support, should people have addiction problems or mental health issues, it will assist in controlling the substance and all its negative effects, per se.
In terms of you're right in terms of binge drinking and especially smoking decreasing. I don't personally believe, and I've seen a lot of the data, the same data that you have, I don't believe the government had much to do with that. It's more to do with the social views of people. And in terms of smoking especially, and they always used to come out with these statistics saying smoking is decreasing, it's decreasing more and more. And I would look around me and I would see everyone who I went to high school with, they smoked, and I finished high school and I went to work and all that. everybody my age smoked. And when I studied a pharmacology paper at university, they brought out the statistics of smoking from 1990 to 2015. Overall, it had decreased, I believe, 58%. It was a substantial number. The catch was, it was mainly the smokers dying off and not being replaced by the generations coming right after them. In terms of smoking in the age demographic 15 to 26, it only decreased by 2%. So really, while there are less people smoking, the most vulnerable ones are barely smoking any less. And when you look at use of marijuana, it's those vulnerable people. We all know one, perhaps even more than one. We all know people who take it too far. They smoke all the weed they can get their hands on. They're always asking you, hey bro, you know where to score? And if the answer to their question goes from, sorry mate, no idea, to why don't you just check your smartphone? There are plenty of places who can hook you up. They are going to have access to a lot more product. Now, in terms of the criminal aspects, and once again, a lot to unpack, but the law as it is now is a massive inconvenience to people who would otherwise take it much too far and have every intention of taking it too far. They'd smoke more pot if they could get their hands on it. The law inconveniences them, and in that sense, we're looking at one camp which wants to save people from a criminal conviction. That's the yes voters. And the no voters who believe that the law has a responsibility to save people from themselves.
It's a very interesting point and way to put it. I do believe that there is a big issue with mental health in this country, and the last thing I'd want is to make that worse. However, coming back to the educational aspect, like anything, there is already there's already a market for it, and the people who are accessing the stuff, they are getting it through an illicit source. So with a legal market, we have control in terms of the substance they are using. We have mental health support and the absence of a criminal conviction. So the implications of that long term, if someone at the age of 18 decides to use cannabis, they get caught, they get convicted, the implications of that down the track could impact their ability to work later on or get that dream job they've always wanted. Like anything, like any substance, as we discussed, alcohol is bad long term. There is currently no restriction on the amount of alcohol one can purchase. I could walk down to the liquor store now and purchase 10 litres of vodka, and nothing's stopping me from drinking it all other than my airway collapsing. And the same will be true for cannabis. I do believe, like I said, there are always going to be teething problems, and I believe that a 14-gram limit for the day is quite high. However, that's intended for the people who live in rural communities who choose to use it, who don't particularly have access to a dispensary close by.
I'm sure they'll put dispensaries wherever there's a market for them, though.
There certainly will be. And again, if someone is smoking that much, that becomes a social issue. Looking at the Portuguese model of decriminalisation, again, the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation, big difference. Decriminalisation, of course, being not penalising people for being in possession of it. The manufacture and distribution, of course, is still a crime. However, possession, they are offered social support as opposed to criminalisation, and that is true for all drugs within the country. And they saw over a 10-year period, they had a massive opioid epidemic similar to the States. Over a 10-year period, they saw a decrease in their heroin use by 50%. And I believe in the legal market, people are going to use illegal substances. Nothing's going to stop them. Our statistics have proven that.
Certainly.
So penalising people doesn't work. It only pushes it into the shadows and into the black market. If we bring this into the light and heavily control it, there's nothing to say that this bill cannot be amended, that heavier constraints are put on it once the legal market is bigger than the illicit market and it's a more desirable source, that we could then turn around and half the daily dose, half the THC content, or put further restrictions, higher taxation in order to implement mental health support or other support services or education around it. However, while the bill is worded the way it is, it looks like a great start. Like anything, it's not perfect.
Well, that is one thing that I very warmly approve of. The way they have certainly intend a lot of the proceeds of government mandated cannabis to go toward mental health and drug support. The only problems with that is that, as the Canadians found out, once again, referring to the early sets of data that may change, may not be 100% accurate, but so I think they've had it for 3 years now, so around that amount of time.
Around that time.
The original forecasts were for about $6 billion to be put into the economy from selling cannabis. The actual figure per year, that is, the actual figure after 3 years was 580 million. It's being sold as this massive amount of money, but we are in a country, and I guess this is a far broader topic, and in some ways it's got more to do with the fact that us Europeans aren't a very nationalistic lot at the end of the day, but we are in a country right now where we can't even keep the profits for our own mineral water in New Zealand. So my question for you is, and I've seen the lobby groups and the money that's gone from these multinational corporations. Some cannabis companies have been partly owned by big tobacco. So what's stopping us? All this money that's supposed to be going to the mental health support, what's stopping us from being exploited by the multinationals, as we always seem to be?
That is a very good question, Jared. From what I've read from the bill so far, the idea is to avoid big tobacco, as you put it, coming in and having sticking their fingers into the pie per se, and trying to get hold of the cannabis gold rush, as you could put it. The legalisation and control bill is suggesting that the people who will be manufacturing and selling the cannabis are going to be New Zealand based. Preferably, they're supporting smaller businesses and they're trying to avoid the interference, we'll call it, of big businesses. I'm not entirely sure how this will happen, but again, this is the way the bill is worded. And as you said, profits are firing off overseas, unfortunately. So having a New Zealand-based business and having a legal market where we've got a new product, we as people refer it to as Cora Gold or other cannabis from the people I've met. It's quite well renowned within New Zealand. To have that these people who are already producing this product put into the workforce in a legal market, in a market where they're giving the resources to produce a product which is safer for people, it will create jobs within the country. There will be working professionals as opposed to criminals. Creating jobs is going to support the economy. If we have a legal market, it will support the tourism industry, as people who choose to use cannabis as adults will come to New Zealand after in a post-COVID world, I hope.
Hopefully.
So
we can only hope.
We can wait and see how 2021 goes, but yeah.
The other thing, I mean, I have to take issue with the aspects of, in terms of criminality of it. The Yes crowd have painted this horrible post-apocalyptic picture of the police stalking people, and you got a joint on you, or 25 to life. We are not, New Zealand is not America. thank God. We do not have the war on drugs the way President Nixon announced it back in the early 1970s. Yes, you can get done for possession, but ordinarily it's with intent to supply. The police have discretion. The police do not have discretion on all offences. If you get pulled over for speeding, as I'm sure that more than 80% of New Zealanders have done, doesn't necessarily mean, and that's the flaw in that, it doesn't necessarily mean they do it habitually, or they should do it at all. But really, the police have discretion on this, whereas they don't. If you get pulled over for speeding, you'll probably get a ticket, or you will get a ticket, because they're not allowed to let you off now. People are arrested and have a cannabis conviction generally because they were in the process of committing a different crime at the same time, and they happen to have drugs on them. Now, it's being sold as a way to reduce the amount of time police spend dealing with drugs, dealing with specifically stopping the cannabis trade. However, the police, should the yes vote pass, the police will, doesn't guarantee it's going to end up in law, but should we legalize cannabis, the police are now going to be enforcing the black market, which will still very much be in effect, charging these dealers with things like tax evasion as well as possession with intent to supply. And I believe the penalties for tax evasion are even higher than that to supply cannabis. It seems a great deal like more of the same at the end of the day.
That's a very good point to make, Jared. While a yes vote and implementation of the legalisation and control bill will result in freeing up some of the police resources, they won't be flying helicopters over fields, for example, to find cannabis plants.
I will give you that it will free up some of their resources.
Absolutely.
There will definitely be a reduction, and despite what I've said about the problems inherent of trying to keep the profits here, yes, we will see some profits, we will see some jobs. I think we all have to acknowledge that it's a positive force in that sense.
Absolutely. Go ahead. On the topic of jobs, we need to consider the export market as well. If we have both, there are a number of companies within New Zealand which are producing medicinal grade export quality medicinal cannabis at the moment. If we can create products that are desirable to the overseas market, that will see a substantial return financially as well. However, back to the topic of criminalisation of police resources. New Zealand is a beautiful country, and we are very lucky that we are not like the States in terms of our law enforcement and our laws surrounding possession of cannabis. It'd be a terrible place if it was. Whilst you're absolutely right, most of the people who are charged with cannabis are either involved in some other aspect of crime, or are those who intend to supply.
Or other drugs crime as well.
Absolutely.
A lot of pot dealers also deal other stuff.
I've discussed this issue in some depth with a couple of police officers who are in two minds as well, like a lot of people within New Zealand at the moment, some of which, and I encourage anyone watching this to do your own research again, talk to the people in the community, talk to the police, talk to medical professionals, and get their opinion before you head out and vote, to be fully informed. The police I've discussed have two arguments: the yes voters and the nopers, as we call them. Some of them believe that it will have the same concerns as you. It will still remain in the hands of the gangs for some time, and it will legitimise the business that they already have. And in my opinion, if they are going to pay taxes, if they're doing something which is legal and it is well regulated, isn't it better to have a tax-paying citizen than to have someone who is doing something illegally? And you're absolutely right around the taxation around that. Tax evasion and fraud is a very serious crime, and I imagine that it will be penalised quite heavily.
Well, I don't think a lot of those gangs have accountants for them.
I
Maybe they do. I've never been in a gang before.
I can't say I've shared that experience myself.
It's interesting. From a member of the medical profession appear to me to be overwhelmingly supportive.
Mm.
However, the police do not. And there have been many anecdotal, admittedly, submissions to local newspapers that I've read of policemen who have said, look, all of my mates in the force, none of them are voting yes. They believe that. They are opposed to it simply because of the proximity to the effects.
Mm.
They bust into a house at night and they have, they see mothers and fathers who are stoned off their minds while the children are going hungry and things like that.
Absolutely. Although in saying that,
do you think their concerns is that emotional and unrepresentative, or are they on the front lines? Are they seeing what we're not?
I believe that the police do have a very unique view into the implications of drug and alcohol use. Again, like any substance, it is a substance of abuse, as is alcohol and prescription medicines. So there is always going to be that risk with a yes vote that we will see increased instances of things like that. However, that comes down to an individual person. Unfortunately, I can't comment on what the police have seen, but again, I've had mixed reviews from the police officers I've spoken to in terms of their thoughts upon legalisation. The last thing I'd want is to put the children of New Zealand at risk. And again, I would absolutely hate to impact on the mental health of New Zealanders.
And politicians regularly score political points by invoking the plight of the children of New Zealand. No doubt about it.
They certainly do. And I can see why. It's a completely reasonable argument.
I already touched on this, but really I'm somewhat ashamed in the fact that usually it's my side who are scaremongering and being all crazy and trying to stoke fear among people into voting no. I'm against scaremongering in all of its nasty forms, simply because it makes it so much harder to get a rational and legitimate point across.
Absolutely.
Would you like to give everybody a closing statement as to why you voted yes? Was it today or yesterday or whenever you voted yes?
A couple of days ago.
Yeah, you got in early. I didn't.
There's plenty of time for anyone who's hasn't voted yet. Polls are open now. And of course close on the 17th. My closing statement for anyone who has not voted yet and is sitting on the fence, I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, the legalisation of cannabis will have some implications on life in New Zealand. The biggest point, as I opened with, is the freeing up of the medicinal market. That will make a substantial difference to people of all walks of life with multiple medical conditions. Including the palliative care industry or area of medicine, I should say. For anyone who's unsure, please do your research and look at the sources which you are getting your research from. The New Zealand Drug Foundation is in support of a yes vote. However, I would suggest that you go to their website and have a look at the information they have provided. The referendum website as well is filled with useful information, including the bill itself, should you choose to read it. Again, we live in a beautiful democracy, New Zealand, so it's your right to choose between a yes or no, but all I ask is that you're fully informed before you make the decision.
And for my one, I want to make it abundantly clear. I don't have much of a problem with the legislation, the proposed legislation, as it's written. To me, it appears to be very well thought out. I'm very skeptical, as I've made clear, in terms of its implementation and how much it's even possible for legislation like this to work effectively.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, it appears to me that an enormous number of very smart people have looked at every aspect of the drug trade, of the effects that marijuana is having, and have written the legislation accordingly. The reason I voted no today comes back to the fundamental reason why people choose to take drugs, regardless of what it is. If you had to put it in a single sentence, it is to get away from reality. Now, we've already touched on this. We have enormous problems with mental health in New Zealand. We mentioned briefly that binge drinking has come down massively in the last 10 years or so. Well, the economy was doing very well in the last 10 years or so. We know that when people are in work more and there's more wealth, there does tend to be less binge drinking. However, throw a couple of doses of the Kung flu at the world's economy, I see some very difficult years ahead. I understand that there are massive implications on people's mental health. I don't want, or rather, I don't feel that this is a step in the right direction, and I don't think we should be encouraging people to look at getting away from reality as a legitimate response to depression, anxiety, and the range of negative emotions that people will be feeling in the tumultuous years to come. That's why I voted no today. You're more than welcome to tell me why I'm wrong. Alex, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And in this time of partisanship and controversial topics like this, I always very much appreciate it when we can have a discussion without attacking each other with hammers.
We'll save that for once the camera's off.
So next week, veganism. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we'll wait and see.
Yeah. This was The World Where We Live. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. The polls are still open until the 17th. Cheers.